The murdered king who created an empire. He ruled a nation that barely existed, and turned it into a war machine that would shake the ancient world. Before Alexander the Great conquered Persia, before the phalanx thundered across Asia, there was Philip II of Macedon, a king whose private life was far more dangerous than any battlefield. He rose to power with no army, no capital, and enemies at every border. And yet, within 2 decades, he united Greece and built the foundation for the largest empire the ancient world would ever see. But what if I told you his greatest battles weren't fought with swords, but in bedrooms, banquets, and betrayals? Philip had 7 wives, lovers of both sexes, and a court pulsing with tension, envy, and ambition. His marriages weren't love stories, they were political landmines, and within those chambers of alliance and seduction, seeds of murder were planted. One lover would be raped, one wife would be insulted, one prince would be pushed aside, and one man, a young, beautiful bodyguard named Pausanias, would plunge a dagger into Philip's heart in front of thousands. But why? Was it revenge? Was it jealousy? Or was it something far darker? Some say Philip was a victim of palace politics. Others whisper that his own wife, Olympias, the ferocious mother of Alexander the Great, orchestrated his death. And then there's the chilling possibility, did Alexander himself know more than he let on? In the ancient world, love was power, betrayal was currency, and kings were never safe, not even from their own families. Stay with us as we step inside the shadowy halls of Macedon's royal court, where sex, strategy, and assassination intertwined to shape history. Because sometimes, the greatest empires are built on the blood of the fathers. The world first heard the name Philip of Macedon not in triumph, but in desperation. It was 359 BCE. Macedon was not a kingdom, it was a crumbling territory, torn apart by tribal raids, foreign invasions, and internal treachery. No standing army, no centralized capital, no unified identity. Once considered a backwater to the glimmering city-states of southern Greece, Macedon had become little more than a buffer zone for stronger powers. And in this vacuum of chaos, a 23-year-old prince returned from exile, not as a savior, but as a gamble. Philip had not grown up with privilege. He had grown up as a hostage, a political pawn in the city of Thebes, held in the care of his enemies. But while others may have rotted in bitterness, Philip watched, he studied. Under the shadow of Epaminondas and the elite Theban generals, he learned the art of hoplite warfare, the mechanics of power, and most crucially, the psychology of men. He saw how loyalty could be manufactured. He saw how fear could be weaponized. And when he finally returned to Macedon, he didn't come back as the same boy who had been taken. He came back speaking the language of dominance. When Philip arrived, 3 armies were closing in on Macedon: Thracians from the east, Illyrians from the northwest, and rival claimants from within his own bloodline. Yet within a matter of months, the young king dismantled each threat with breathtaking precision. Not because he had more soldiers, he had fewer, but because he changed the way they fought. Gone were the disorganized warbands and tribal levies. In their place, he introduced the sarissa, an 18-foot pike, longer than anything used in Greek warfare. He restructured the phalanx, drilled men in brutal new formations, and taught them to fight not as individuals, but as a single, ruthless engine. Macedonian warfare was no longer defensive, it became predatory. But Philip was not just building an army. He was building a state from scratch. He poured silver into road systems, established permanent garrisons, and introduced marriage alliances that turned enemies into in-laws. He paid mercenaries when necessary, but he preferred loyalty that came from debt, both financial and personal. He rewarded nobles with land, but always divided their power. No general could rise too high. No clan could stand alone. Every move he made had a counterbalance. Still, There was one war Philip never stopped fighting: the war against perception. To the Greek world, Macedonians were considered crude, half barbarian, too wild to ever govern themselves, let alone others. The Macedonian tongue was mocked, their customs ridiculed, in Athenian comedies. Macedonians were punchlines brutes in fur cloaks who drank too much and talked too loud. Philip knew the insult. He had heard it all, and he made it his mission to turn that contempt into fear. Over the next decade, Philip didn't just defend Macedon, he expanded it. First into Thessaly, where his marriage to a local princess gave him a foothold. Then into Thrace, where he captured key gold mines. Then into Chalkidiki and northern Greece, exploiting every feud between the Greek city-states like a man playing chess with a trembling hand on every piece. He used diplomacy as a scalpel and war as a hammer. When a city resisted, he besieged it. When a noble rebelled, he married their sister. When Athens denounced him, he funded their rivals. And slowly, the image of the barbarian king began to crack. Philip could debate in the agora as well as any Athenian. He could flatter, negotiate, inspire. But behind his smile was the certainty of steel. He held festivals where he honored Greek gods, performed tragedies in perfect dialect, and offered lavish sacrifices. Yet his eyes never strayed far from the horizon, because Philip wasn't merely trying to survive. He was preparing for something larger than himself. By the time most of Greece realized what he was doing, it was too late. City by city, ally by ally, he stitched together an empire without ever calling it that. He didn't crown himself as conqueror. He presented himself as a unifier. And in 338 BCE, at the Battle of Chaeronea, he proved it. Macedonian forces crushed the combined armies of Athens and Thebes in a decisive, thunderous assault. It was there that his teenage son, Alexander, first tasted blood, and it was there that the old Greek world began to die. But even at the height of his power, Philip was never truly safe. For all his military genius, for all his political cunning, his greatest threat lay not outside the palace, but within its walls. Because as he conquered new lands, he made new enemies, and as he married new wives, he inherited new rivalries. Each alliance was a thread in a web, and behind every smile at court, there was a dagger hidden in linen. He had turned a broken kingdom into a machine of conquest, but in doing so, he had also surrounded himself with ambition unfiltered, unchecked, and waiting for the moment he blinked. And one day, Philip understood early that loyalty could be bought, but permanence required something deeper. In a world where thrones were secured as much by marriage as by blood, he wielded matrimony like a sword. He did not marry for affection or personal comfort. Every wife he took was a treaty. Every child he sired was a claim staked into a neighboring kingdom. His palace wasn't a home. It was a map of alliances dressed in silk and perfume. By the time he reached his mid-30s, Philip had married more women than most kings had ministers, 7 official wives, and likely more unofficial consorts, each chosen with a purpose. There was Odata, the Illyrian princess, who brought peace to the northern border and an influx of hardened warriors to his ranks. There was Pella of Ilymea, a local noble's daughter, whose dowry was loyalty from a powerful mountain clan. From Thessaly came Nicopolis, whose people controlled key cavalry routes, and Philina of Larissa, another connection to vital plains in the north. But it was Olympias, princess of Epirus, who would redefine his court and seal his fate. She was not merely a bride, she was a storm given human form, initiated into the rites of Dionysus, raised in the mystic cults of a wild, mountainous land. Olympias brought with her a ferocious intelligence and a zeal that made her both mesmerizing and unpredictable. She did not come to Macedon to be one among many. She came to rule beside Philip, and when she bore him a son, Alexander, she expected nothing less than supremacy. In public, Olympias performed the role of royal consort with practiced elegance. In private, she built her own court within the court. Her attendants were loyal to her, her priests feared her, and her influence seeped through every corner of the palace. Philip, ever the tactician, encouraged this at first. He believed in balancing power through competition. He thought that by pitting his wives' factions against each other, he could keep them too divided to challenge him. But Olympias was not just a rival to other queens. She was a mother, and Alexander was her weapon from the moment he could walk. She filled his ears with visions of destiny. She whispered of Achilles, of divine bloodlines, of empires waiting to be seized. Philip, meanwhile, looked at his son and saw potential, but also danger. The boy was brilliant, quick-tempered, proud, a mirror of his mother, and in a palace where love was political, even fatherhood became a calculation. The other wives watched all this unfold with sharpened interest. They too had sons. They too understood that in Macedon, succession was never guaranteed. There were no written rules, no laws of primogeniture, only proximity to power and the will to seize it. So, while Olympias nurtured Alexander's legend, other wives cultivated their own ambitions, whispering in corners, offering gifts to priests, aligning themselves with generals or envoys. Each sought to elevate their child above the rest. The palace became a theater of veiled threats and courted loyalties. Philip, often away on campaign, returned each time to a household more fractured than the last. But instead of resolving the tensions, he fed them. New marriages followed. New queens were introduced. Each arrival was a signal. Each wedding, a move on the chessboard. The halls of Pella, the Macedonian capital, echoed not with music or laughter, but with the silent grind of ambition clashing behind smiling faces. Philip never truly lived with one wife. He moved between chambers, between alliances, between obligations. His presence was a promise, his absence a threat. And yet, with every new bond he forged, he diluted the power of the previous one. Olympias, once central, now felt herself surrounded. She watched as younger wives arrived, women with fresh bloodlines and powerful families backing them. She saw her influence, once total, begin to fragment. And then came Cleopatra Eurydice. She was not foreign. She was Macedonian nobility, young, beautiful, untainted by the politics of foreign courts, and most dangerously, she was the niece of Attalus, one of Philip's most trusted generals, when Philip took her as his seventh wife. It wasn't merely a marriage, it was a shift, for the first time. He had chosen a bride from within, someone who could bear him a son without any taint of foreign lineage. To Macedonian traditionalists, that meant legitimacy. To Olympias, it meant war. At the wedding banquet, Attalus, drunk and triumphant, made a toast. He spoke of new blood, of true heirs, of the future of Macedon unburdened by foreign queens. It was an insult aimed squarely at Olympias and at Alexander. Tension cracked the air like a drawn bow. Alexander stood, flung his cup, and accused Attalus of treason. Philip, furious, drew his sword against his own son, only to stumble in a drunken haze. The room froze. Days later, Alexander left the palace, his mother following him into exile in Epirus. Philip had thought he could control the fire by dividing it, but he had only spread the flame. By attempting to unite a kingdom through marriage, Philip had created a court where every bedroom was a battlefield, every cradle a throne in waiting. He had played each faction against the other, but now they were all watching him. His wives no longer sought favor. They sought survival. And his son, the boy bred for glory, now stood on the outside, watching a younger, more Macedonian heir being groomed for his place. The system Philip built had no safety valve. No single wife had the power to dominate, but all of them had the motive to destroy. And the one thing they shared, the one unifying trait, was the understanding that Philip, for all his brilliance, was mortal. He believed himself invincible, surrounded by loyalty he had purchased with land, marriage, and flattery. But what he had truly built was a machine of ambition, and one misstep, one insult too many, one queen too far would be enough to make it all collapse. Among the many men who circled the throne of Macedon, one stood closer than the rest, not through blood or politics, but through intimacy. His name was Pausanias, a young nobleman of striking beauty and sharp intellect, selected to serve among Philip's elite royal guard. But his role quickly moved beyond protection, in the subtle, ritual-laden traditions of the Macedonian court, where lines between mentorship, loyalty, and desire often blurred. Pausanias became more than a soldier. He became the king's companion. For years, their bond offered Pausanias extraordinary favor. He dined at Philip's table, stood closer than most in public ceremonies, and walked beside the king in moments others were kept far. He was not the first youth to catch Philip's attention, and he would not be the last, but for a time. He was unmatched. In a court where proximity to the monarch was power in itself, he had both position and presence. Others envied him. Some feared him. He carried himself with the quiet pride of someone who believed his place had been earned through affection and trust. But favor, in Macedon, was as fleeting as breath on glass. When another youth also named Pausanias entered the palace, younger, livelier, and more politically useful, the original found himself cast into shadow. The new favorite was not just an object of Philip's interest, but a relative of a powerful family, and his rise in status was both social and strategic. The shift was not announced, but it didn't need to be. The signs were clear. A change in who rode next to the king, a different name called first in the lineup of guards, new whispers in the marble corridors. Pausanias. The elder did not take this quiet demotion in silence. He complained, he challenged, and he ridiculed his replacement with sharp words meant to wound. In a court where reputation was everything, this was not merely personal, it was political. The backlash was swift and brutal. At a private gathering, orchestrated by supporters of the new favorite and led by the powerful General Attalus. Pausanias was ambushed. He was plied with wine, mocked, then subjected to a calculated act of humiliation and violence. Accounts differ on the precise details, but all agree it was not just an assault, it was a statement, a declaration that his time had passed, and that favor, once lost, would not return. In the culture of Macedon, such a violation was more than shameful. It stripped a man not only of dignity, but of place. Pausanias, once the confidant of a king, was now a symbol of discarded loyalty. But he wasn't broken. He sought justice, and he sought it from the only man who could deliver it, Philip himself. He laid the blame directly on Attalus, whose connections to the new queen, Cleopatra Eurydice, had only grown stronger. Pausanias expected punishment, a public reckoning, perhaps even banishment for the general who had overseen his downfall. Philip offered none. Attalus was too important. He commanded troops critical to Philip's campaigns. He was family to the queen, whose very presence secured the loyalty of a volatile faction within Macedon, and in a palace already brimming with tension between wives, sons, and generals. Philip saw no advantage in opening another wound. Instead, he chose appeasement. He offered Pausanias gifts, honors, a promotion, but not justice, not the one thing the young man truly wanted. What Philip miscalculated was not Pausanias' pride, but his memory. In public, Pausanias resumed his duties. He stood guard at ceremonies, walked the same halls, saluted the same lords, but behind his composure lay something colder, sharper. He watched Attalus rise. He listened to the growing acclaim of Cleopatra Eurydice's household. He saw Olympias retreat to Epirus. He watched Alexander leave the palace, and slowly, he came to understand a truth that had haunted many before him in Macedon. Favor could not be regained. It could only be taken back. As tensions in the court escalated, so too did Pausanias's resolve. He began speaking less. He trained harder. His gaze lingered not on the marble columns or passing courtiers, but on Philip himself. Every gesture, every word, every lapse in security. Philip had surrounded himself with opulence and soldiers, with music and banners, but in his desire to appear untouchable, he had grown careless. He often walked without guards. He preferred the spectacle of command to the caution of protection, to those who knew him best. He seemed a man who believed his reign was beyond challenge. But for Pausanias, who had once known the king as closely as any man could, that belief was a flaw. In Macedon, violence was a language older and more truthful than diplomacy, and betrayal was never unexpected. It was part of the cost of power. Pausanias understood this better than most. He did not plan in haste. He waited. He chose his moment with the same precision he once devoted to guarding his king. And when the time came, he would not act alone. There were others in the court who saw opportunity in change, who whispered in private that the old king had lost his fire, that the heir had been cast aside, that the gods no longer smiled on the house of Philip. No single event forged his decision. No one act of cruelty defined it. But taken together, the loss of favor, the public humiliation, the denial of justice, the rise of enemies each became a stone on his back, and eventually, the weight became unbearable. From favored companion to forgotten ornament, Pausanias transformed under the pressure of betrayal, not into a victim, but into something far more dangerous, into a man with nothing left to lose. Philip's marriage to Cleopatra Eurydice altered everything. Up to that point, Celtic blades, Thracian gold, and dynastic marriages had shaped his kingdom. But marrying a young Macedonian noblewoman was something else. It marked a shift from alliance building to legacy guarding. Cleopatra's bloodline was pure Macedonian, encapsulating centuries of native pride, no foreign princess, no distant claim. For the first time, Philip stood a chance of producing an heir undeniably true to Macedon, a child whose lineage could rally every traditionalist in the land. The wedding banquet glowed in the torchlight of Pella's great hall, music swelling against a backdrop of marble statues and captured trophies of war. Generals swapped toasts, ministers whispered in corners, and Macedonians celebrated the promise of new unity. But underneath the veneer of joy lay a complicated tension. Philip's 7 wives had already fractured his household into competing factions. Olympias, the forceful princess of Epirus, watched with narrowed eyes. She had delivered Alexander into the world, weaving a narrative of divine blood and destined conquest. But Cleopatra's arrival threatened that narrative with something warmer, more acceptable to the old guard, a son married into Macedon itself. Attalus, the general whose niece this new queen was, stood prominent among the guests. Wine flowed, and patriots cheered his speeches, praises for Macedonia's rebirth under Philip, and lance thrusts at foreign influence, a thinly veiled allusion to Olympias's origins. When he raised his goblet to hail the king's legitimate heir, the phrase struck like a blade. Alexander, standing nearby, snapped. He flung his cup across the floor in anger and dared Attalus to explain what he meant. Gasps rippled through the hall. Philip surged forward, sword drawn, but a crowd of generals restrained him. In that single moment, father and son clashed not just in anger, but in symbolism. Philip's vision of unity through birthright collided with the web of alliances that bound his reign. The disturbance left the court shaken. Alexander stormed out. Olympias followed him to Epirus that very night, leaving the capital to rumble with speculation. Philip stood amidst the aftermath of his own design. His 7 marriages had been calculated moves, but this last one seemed personal, reckless even. He'd sought to blend the alliances into identity, to stabilize Macedon beyond his reign. Instead, he ignited envy, fear, and loyalty fractures more explosive than any battlefield dissent. In the days that followed, Philip confronted his son privately. Words were exchanged, maybe even a raised voice. But filial lines had been drawn. Alexander, once destined to inherit an empire, now felt deprioritized. Rumors spread of clandestine oaths sworn between Olympias and Alexander in Epirus, of promises to stand against any threat to his birthright. Meanwhile, Cleopatra's household gained confidence. Attalus and his men were no longer subtle. They met Philip in council and spoke boldly of securing a Macedonian successor. Philip agreed, citing stability. But each nod he gave deepened the division he'd hoped to resolve. Across the palace, 7 women watched their power balance shift beneath them. Some aligned with Cleopatra, sensing her formal status might outshine theirs. Others tightened loyalties with generals, priests, even foreign diplomats. Everywhere, servants listened and carried tales like Tinder. And Macedonia, just days ago united in celebration, found itself on the brink of civil confrontation. Philip had ignited internal fires he could not extinguish. The throne felt smaller, more isolating. A summer of promise bore the weight of dread. Philip returned to his campaigns, but not with his usual fervor. He spent nights in strategy rooms, reviewing letters and envoys' reports, but always conscious of court whispers. He began wearing more armor, even in private audiences. Soldiers noticed there was tension behind his commands, unease in his smile. He'd given his last marriage in pursuit of peace, but the palace had become more volatile than ever. It was as if the very act of legitimizing a Macedonian heir provoked the exact rivalries he tried to suppress. As the rumor mill roared, Cleopatra Eurydice's pregnancy announcement arrived an imperial heartbeat that transformed palace politics once again. Her supporters celebrated it as proof of Macedon's future. Olympias's faction stiffened in response. Alexander returned, but he came with purpose, presenting himself not as a son, but as an empire's champion. His return reignited the battle lines. Allies readied their loyalties. Priests offered prayers for a righteous succession. Generals chose sides based on kin and potential inheritance. Philip had built a court perfect for balance, but when that balance shifted toward legacy, everything threatened to fall apart. By the time the child was born, it would be too late to restore the fragile equilibrium. The moment Cleopatra's son drew air in Pella's halls, the dream of unity would fray into 2 camps, one celebrating a boy of pure Macedon, the other sheltering a boy born of myth and destiny. The palace had become a stage for a duel far more perilous than any on the battlefield, the duel where heritage met ambition. And the only weapons were oaths whispered in the dark between wives, mothers, sons, and their most trusted soldiers. Those walls had grown so thick with intrigue that one could be cut just by passing through their shadows. And Philip, whose vision had once brought kingdoms to heel, now stood alone before the most personal war he had ever waged. The sun rose over Aegae with the kind of brilliance that no omen could touch. It was the summer of 336 BCE, and the ancient capital of Macedon had come alive with preparation. The city had not been used for royal ceremonies in decades, but Philip had insisted this would be no ordinary wedding. His daughter, Cleopatra, named after her stepmother, but born to Olympias, was to marry Alexander I of Epirus, her mother's own brother. It was a union of 2 powerful dynasties, and for Philip, a final masterstroke to unite his fractured house through blood. Every ally had been summoned. Envoys from Thessaly, Thebes, and Athens arrived bearing gifts. Veterans of Cheronea lined the stone streets in armor, polished to mirror shine. Banners of red and gold snapped in the breeze. Musicians rehearsed odes to Philip's victories. No king in Macedonian history had stood taller than this moment. He had conquered Greece without calling it conquest. He had aligned the tribes without civil war. His enemies had been crushed or converted. His authority, after 2 decades of blood and diplomacy, was near absolute. But beneath the glory, silence pooled in corners where shadows gathered. Rumors drifted like dust in the rafters of the palace. Olympias, conspicuously absent. Alexander, recently returned but distant. Attalus, present and watchful. Cleopatra Eurydice, still recovering from childbirth, her newborn son quietly named Caranus. And Pausanias, the former favorite, who moved now like a ghost duty-bound, stone-faced, and never far from the king. Philip's decision to walk into the theater unguarded had been deliberate. The theater at Igi, built into the slope of a hillside, could hold thousands. It was open air, flanked by high stone walls and terraces filled with spectators. The royal platform had been built at center stage. He wanted no barrier between himself and the people. He believed in spectacle. It was what had kept him on the throne longer than any Macedonian king before him. The illusion of invincibility. He wore white, unarmed, without a breastplate, with only a wreath of laurel crowning his hair. His sword-bearers stood back. His bodyguards held the perimeter. He entered to a roar of voices and the stamping of thousands of feet on stone. The crowd stood. The sun caught the gold trim of his cloak. The gods, it seemed, had smiled. And then one man moved. From the edge of the dais, Pausanias surged forward, not hesitantly, not trembling, but as if he'd done it 100 times in his mind. The dagger he carried was not Macedonian. It was Celtic, curved and sharp, smuggled into the ceremony without inspection. He drove it straight into Philip's left side, beneath the ribs, piercing the heart in a single calculated thrust. The roar of celebration turned into screams for a breathless instant. Philip staggered, his mouth open, eyes wide, not with pain, but with disbelief. Then he collapsed. Pausanias turned and ran, not toward freedom, but toward the edge of the theater where horses had been left. 3 guards gave chase. He never made it to the animals. He was struck down, speared, and silenced before he could speak a word. The knife was recovered, his body dragged away. Witnesses, stunned and paralyzed, could hardly recount the steps between cheer and blood. It had all taken less than 30 seconds. In the chaos, the question wasn't just how Pausanias had done it, but who had helped him. He had been part of Philip's inner guard. He knew the routes, the gaps in the phalanx of protection, the timing of entrances. No one believed he acted alone. But with the assassin dead, the inquiry died with him. What remained was speculation, and there was no shortage. Olympias returned to Pella almost immediately, draped in mourning, but moving with uncanny speed. Within days, Cleopatra Eurydice's household was dismantled. Attalus, despite his absence at the scene, was seized and executed without trial. Cleopatra herself was placed under guard. Her newborn son, Caranus, disappeared from the records in the space of a week. The royal court had been purged. The boy king had not yet been crowned, but the battlefield had already been cleared. Alexander stepped forward into power as if born for the moment. His composure unnerved older generals. His first acts were swift, securing the army's loyalty, appeasing nobles, reaffirming treaties. But beneath the surface, a far more personal victory had already been won. His greatest rival for the throne, Cleopatra Eurydice's bloodline, was gone. Whether by design or accident, Philip's death had handed him everything. Some claimed Olympias had commissioned the murder, unable to bear the idea of another heir displacing her son. Others pointed to Attalus, whose overreach had drawn threats from both Olympias and Alexander. Whispers even floated of Persian agents, bribing court insiders to kill the king before he could lead a campaign east. But none of it was proven. The records stayed silent, the bodies piled up, and the living stayed quiet. Philip's death did not shatter Macedon. It clarified it. All the tensions he had kept in balance collapsed inward and crystallized around one figure, Alexander. The power games of the court, The rivalries, the succession debates, they ended with a knife in the king's chest, in a strange way. The assassination completed Philip's project. Macedon was unified, but the price had been the man who built it. His body was burned in a golden coffin and buried in a royal tomb fit for a god. The flames consumed his armor, his crown, and the echoes of a reign defined by cunning, charisma, and cold calculation. No man before him had transformed Macedon the way he did, and no man after would rule it the same way again. Because the man who took his place would not rule by marriage or by politics. He would rule by conquest. In the end, Philip II was not undone by a foreign army or a failed campaign. His legacy was not drowned in the chaos of invasion, nor shattered by rebellion. It ended with a blade in his chest, wielded by someone who once stood closest to him, and in that final moment on the stone stage of a royal theater built for celebration. Not death, he became more than a king. He became a symbol of everything he had built and everything he could not control. His death echoed far beyond the walls of Igai. It silenced the feuds he had tried to manage and gave shape to a dynasty that had lived too long in shadows. The empire he envisioned, the wars he never got to lead, the sun he tried to shape into a weapon, all of it was now in motion, and the court he once ruled with absolute precision became a palace of ghosts, haunted by the choices that forged it. For Alexander, the crown came not as inheritance, but as confirmation. The boy who had once stood outside the line of succession returned not as an heir, but as a force of nature. He buried his father, erased his rivals, and marched east toward immortality. But somewhere in his shadow followed the lesson that even the most brilliant rule is only one betrayal away from collapse. Philip ruled not by right, but by mastery. He manipulated desire, loyalty, and bloodline to forge a kingdom. Yet the same tools that built his power also turned against him. In the game of kings, he played like a god, but died like a man. The dagger that pierced him cut through the illusion of control and left only questions. How much of his fall was fate? How much was design? And in that silence, history offers no answers, only echoes.